All right. Welcome to Topic 1.5 of AP World History Modern. Topic 1.5 covers developments in Africa between the years, roughly between circa 1200 to 1450. We will bridge those time periods a little bit, especially as this is Unit 1 of AP World History. We do need to introduce a little bit of the stuff going before the curriculum has our dates going on. So, yeah, there'll be a little bit of that. So, but yes, developments in Africa here. So let's go ahead and we'll get started. All right. So our learning objectives today that we are trying to cover as set out by AP, what they want us as students to know and as teachers to teach is you need to be able to do this objective. Okay. It's actually numbered objective 1, so unit 1, objective J, and this topic will cover that, and that's explain how and why states in Africa developed and changed over time. So we're going to talk about formation of states. In Africa, we're going to go through a few of them and some of how those states functioned. All right, let's just kind of set the stage here a little bit. Zach, sorry, the slide got a little messy there. See if that helps. Okay. Good enough. All right. So, yeah, I'm sorry, kind of the picture kind of messed up some things there. But here's what we got. So, setting up the stage here, a lot of the real important information we get about Africa in this time period, a lot of it comes from a very, very important source. And that is from a man named Ibn Battuta. Now, Ibn Battuta was, by profession, an Islamic scholar, basically worked as a lawyer. He was a what you'd call a lawyer that worked with Sharia law, the Islamic law. And he spent a lot of time traveling basically throughout the Islamic world, and he traveled extensively, basically the entire width of Africa, and moving all the way into Delhi, into India. Basically, what he did was covered the major part of the Islamic world, right? And covered it. So yeah, he was a Sharia law. So a Sharia law is Islamic law, and in countries that practice that, basically Islamic law is basically synonymous with secular law. It's one and the same. So he cataloged a lot. He's one of the greatest travelers. In fact, one thing he's been called before is kind of the Islamic Marco Polo. If you're familiar with him, with his extensive travels there. But yeah, he shows a lot about the interconnectivity of Asia, of Africa, and of Southern Europe. But anyway, a few things going on to set the stage as well is that Islam had already had influence in Africa for centuries, right? Islam itself started back in the 600s, and then into the 700s was moving its way across specifically northern Africa. And up to this point, there are parts of Africa that have embraced Islam, but there are also parts that have resisted it. And some of it's kind of interesting, like literally resisting it, like protecting local churches by building labyrinths around them and reservoirs around like churches and tunnels. It's kind of interesting to have that. Now, as far as the southern tip of Africa, though, that's going to have very, very little actual contact with Islam until later than the time that we're covering up here. So we're talking about mostly northern Africa and kind of central Africa from coast to coast. All right. So let's start with the political structures, and we're going to focus on inland Africa, because inland Africa is very different than coastal Africa. So by about 1000, most sub-Saharan Africa had adopted agriculture by this point. They were agricultural communities. Okay. Now, unlike many places this time, like in Asia or Europe, there was no centralized power in the interior of Africa. There just wasn't. It was very tribal based. Now, there's a term for this that you want to know, and you know it's called kin based. Right? Kin-based societies. Basically, you have families and extended families, and they kind of govern themselves. Right? Now, they're often under the direction of a chief. The chief is usually a male, and this male chief handled conflicts and dealings with others. Okay? Now, sometimes villages would, these different villages would work in common and would kind of operate together and then become kind of like a district. Okay. And in those situations, what you had is those chiefs, they would kind of work together to handle district-wide problems that they have. Now, what ended up happening is with the success of agriculture around, 1000, you saw the population increase, right? Big population increase. And because of that, the society became harder to govern in these kin-based systems as population increased. Because kin-based systems work if you are in a smaller group. It's much easier to do that. But when it's bigger, it's a little bit difficult because there's so many different families and things like that. So competition for land and competition for sources and power led to a lot of fighting between villages and districts. Probably the big reason why you don't really see a lot of centralized power in the interior of Africa that way. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about just a few of the early kind of kingdoms, even the ones kind of popping up before the time period that we're really covering here. So there's called the Hausa kingdoms. Okay, and so these people, they're an ethnic group, and they formed from what we believe was about 7 states. Now, these states were basically existed in where today we would consider Nigeria, and they probably got going before year 1000. Now, there was a loose connection between these kingdoms through kinship ties, probably some relation between the different kinship groups there. But like we've said, did not have a central authority. There's no ruler over all of them. And one thing about them too that might have kept them from unity and some of the growth was that they were prone to frequent outside domination, people coming in and invading and competing. Right. Now, some of these kingdoms had specialties. Like one example is one of the Hausa kingdoms specialized in cotton. Right. Remember, this is an agricultural time where you're starting to see much more of that in Africa in sub-Saharan Africa than you had seen before. Right. Agriculture has been around in northern Africa, like Egypt, for, of course, millennia. So now what really started to change things for everything below the Sahara was the expansion and basically creation of trans-Saharan trade. For so much of African history, the northern Mediterranean coast, it'd be the southern Mediterranean coast, the northern part of Africa was very separated from everything south of the Sahara Desert. Now, the Sahara Desert is the largest desert in the world, right? It's basically the size of the United States. And crossing that with trade was nearly impossible. It was too difficult to be able to, and unsafe to actually do a lot of that. Now, some things changed over time. You saw extensive use of like the camel, specifically camel saddles and that sort of thing. But the trans-Saharan trade really changed things because there are resources in Central Africa, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more later. It was Islamic traders coming from the north that really were the ones that tried to push into Central Africa to be able to trade. So once that happened, that cross-Saharan trade or trans-Saharan trade, something you want to know, starts, it really opens up Central Africa there. Okay. Now, Islam, as far as heading down into south of the Sahara Desert, really starts to come around the 14th century. So it's kind of been a while to get real deep into the central part of Africa. So around the 14th century, you started to see, again, Islam introduced by missionaries and, of course, traders. So you see much more of an effort starting to happen here. All right, let's move on a little bit. Now we're going to talk about West and East Africa. So we just talked about Central Africa. Let's talk basically about more of the coastal Africa here. So trade with these groups is really what started to make these areas important in really the global scene. Okay. exchange of goods brought wealth, brought a lot of political power, and a lot of cultural diversity as people are coming in and out of these Western and Eastern African communities there. So Islam, of course, entered as well as trade started to get introduced there. And Islam was kind of adding itself to a lot of pre-existing belief systems that were there. So like practice of animism. If you were here in if you were here for our previous lesson, we talked about animism. That's basically like a belief that physical objects can also have like a supernatural element to them, which was also common here as well as in other parts of the world, like in the Americas, kind of a similar belief. But also Christianity. Christianity had been introduced into parts of Africa, although largely rejected in a lot of areas. And we're going to talk about East Africa in a little bit. That's where it actually kind of took off, as in Ethiopia. But that had come in actually some of the earliest centuries of Christianity at all. So we're talking early CE era there. Okay, there are 4 major kingdoms of this era that we're going to spend most of the lesson today talking about. We're going to talk about Ghana, Mali, Zimbabwe, and Ethiopia. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with Ghana. Now, don't exactly equate modern Ghana with this kingdom of Ghana. It's actually not really located by them, and I can show you a little bit later. Kind of we're talking about a little bit more distant from what today would be Ghana. Now, we believe that they were possibly founded around the 5th century, so we're talking a long time ago. That's the 400s, reaching their peak around probably the 8th to 11th centuries. Okay, now what made Ghana very successful to be a target for trade was gold and ivory. Right, gold and ivory. Muslim traders were very, very interested in that and bringing that up more north. So they traded. These rulers sold the gold and ivory to Muslim traders for things like salt, copper, cloth, and tools. They had a capital city at Kumbai Saleh. And they did have a centralized government. Remember how we were saying up to this point in kind of history, most places now have a centralized government? We see that now. Okay, we do see that now. Now, one of the things that really made Ghana kind of stand apart from a lot of the other groups around them was their military superiority. So specifically, because they had a military armed with iron weapons, right? Iron metallurgy is starting to really pick up in this time. And Ghana used that, of course, to their advantage by having iron weapons, which, of course, are better than, the alternative, wood, stone, those sort of things. Okay, now we're going to talk real briefly about the Kingdom of Mali. So just kind of going back, they are going to sort of occupy a region very similar to what Ghana had. Okay, so by the 12th century or so, Ghana had basically kind of gone to the wayside. And Mali basically replaced them, the Kingdom of Mali. Now, this was an incredibly profitable trading society, specifically thriving in gold trade. They are kind of almost the gold capital, basically, of Africa here. At a time when gold was one of the very, very few universally accepted trade goods. Gold has, by many societies around the world had been agreed upon as a valuable thing because, the reason a resource is valuable is because people accept that it has value, and gold was like that. And so that made them extremely profitable. And if you controlled that, the gold trade, you are going to be one of the richest people ever. One of the most famous, people like that, many you might have heard of, and will be talked about more in later topics, is Mansa Musa. He's basically controlled the gold trade coming out of here of Western Africa, and because of that has been considered the richest man that has actually ever lived. So you can talk about the wealth that can be coming out of this. Now, Mali was founded by a Muslim, someone who had become a Muslim, the ruler Sundiata, and that really helped grow Mali, because if you are a Muslim in Africa, you immediately have a large network of potential traders, because the Islamic community is so into trade as an economy. It's pretty good for business to be a Muslim. To be honest, there it really opens up your opportunities. Now with Mali, being, again, founded by Muslims, basically, and that being the dominant faith there. And with the wealth that they had there, it also became a kingdom that became a really big target for Islamic scholarship. Mosques and universities were built in their city of Timbuktu with some kind of neat features. Now, what are you looking at here? This doesn't look like a typical one, but this is a mosque. This is the Great Mosque at Timbuktu. Doesn't look anything. It's very African, right, in its architecture and its style. And that's one thing you're going to find out is the Islam that is in sub-Saharan Africa really has taken on kind of a local cultural tradition as well. They mix a lot of the styles in there. And when it was more adaptive in those cultures, usually Islam became more and more popular. Right, so you can see this does not look like a mosque, that you would see in Mecca or Cairo or something like that. It's very Mali, in that way. But again, this became a central place for scholarship as well as worship here. Very, very neat, though, and still standing today. Okay, so Ghana. Ghana today is down here, if you can see my mouse, kind of in the southern part of Western Africa here along the coast, around these rivers. But the Kingdom of Ghana we had just talked about was actually up here. Okay. Now, remember, they are going to basically collapse by the 12th century, and the Mali Empire, which is the lined orange, you can see they're going to expand much bigger, are going to replace them. And now you also see the trans-Saharan trade routes. So you would get these travelers, these camel caravans, and they would come down here and trade for gold and salt. Those were the two big things, gold and salt, which came in high abundance down here. And then that would get traded up north and make its way to, other parts of the world. Now, what we're going to talk about here soon is a couple other groups. This is where Ethiopia is. If you can see my mouse here, in Eastern Africa, we're going to be talking about them. And then we're also going to be talking about Zimbabwe, which is down below here as well. So we're going to head to East Africa here. All right. So let's kind of head to southeastern Africa with Zimbabwe. So Zimbabwe was established way back in the 9th century in East Africa. And today it is actually located in modern-day Zimbabwe, as well as part of the modern-day country of Mozambique. Now, what made them that kind of really stood out specifically was the extensive use of stone architecture. You did not actually see a lot of that, not in the fortified way that I'm going to show you here. I'll show you some pictures of Zimbabwe. It was, again, a city kind of made of stone. Many people were using wood, as it was more malleable, to use. So it was the most powerful of the most powerful East African kingdom, basically in the time period that we are in here. So between the 12th century and the 15th century, they are the most powerful one. Now, they are inland, as you can go back to my map here, a lot of it, like Great Zimbabwe, we're going to talk about the city of Great Zimbabwe, is definitely inland, but they did interact with the coastal trading cities that you're going to see here, the Swahili coast. But just so you can get a geographic idea of what's happening here. Okay, so they, especially originally on, were really built upon agriculture. They were an agricultural society, right? And grazing with animals. And then also did trade and had mined gold, which, again, is a common thing in Africa, maybe the most profitable thing that comes out that the outside world wants. And like I was showing you there, they traded with the Swahili states, which is a set of city-states along the east coast. And just to go back to the map one more time, what the Swahili coast states, like these cities over here, what they do is they do coastal trade with Muslims coming from Southwest Asia. So basically from the Middle East. So ships come, around whether it's through the Red Sea or through the Indian Ocean and make their way along these cities. So what you get is Zimbabwe is going to have these goods. They get traded to the cities here, these eastern coast cities, and then they get traded to their final destinations. Okay. So Zimbabwe, in that way, was kind of indirectly tied to what we call the Indian Ocean trade. Something we've been talking about, but the Indian Ocean trade was a huge connecting, maybe the most connecting, definitely next to the Silk Road, the most basically connected trade network that there is in the world. So this connected East Africa with up north to the Middle East, so South Asia, where like India is, and then all the way through, the Straits of Malacca, all the way to East Asia, hooking up with China and Japan. And we absolutely know they traded because we have found archaeologically these different things in these different places. We have seen Chinese pottery, in Africa, and vice versa, and other items vice versa. So this was there's tons of evidence for this. This was going on, and it was definitely going on for many centuries. Now, the strength of Zimbabwe and the lasting nature of it depended on, like I was saying, its stone fortifications. I'm about to show you this. They had the most extensive stone features that you had in all of sub-Saharan Africa. Their walls, at their height, the height of power, stood 30 feet tall and were 15 feet thick. And where you saw this the most was in their big capital city. So their capital city was called the Great Zimbabwe. I'm about to show you some pictures here in a second here. But they're basically, from what we understand, probably the first large stone walls built in Africa without the use of mortar. Right? So keeping them maintained would also be difficult in that. And by their peak or so, it was probably about 20,000 people living in the city, which is very impressive for the time, especially in Africa, as populations of urban centers just were not very large. However, we are pretty sure, because the people, the city of Great Zimbabwe and kind of the surrounding region was abandoned. And likely due to overgrazing. They, again, a big part of their economy and their culture was raising animals, and they overgrazed. Probably didn't try to stay more balanced in consuming, the grazing than letting it replenish itself. Okay. All right, with that, let's move on. So there are some of the ruins of Great Zimbabwe that are around today. Here's one of the thickest of the walls that you can see there. Now, again, this looks nothing like what it would have been. This would have been a far more connected structure with much more towering walls. And I believe when the city was eventually abandoned, a lot of the stone was repurposed and kind of, because it was without mortar, was repurposed probably for other things. Okay, but yeah, 30 up to 30 feet high and 15 feet thick. Again, without the use of mortar. That's very impressive. These are the most fortified stone structures in African history up through this point. But yeah, you can see a little bit of that. Let me show you some more pictures, some more first-person kind of looks there. And again, the strength of these walls is what let Zimbabwe be able to exist as a powerful state with many, many competitors around it for centuries. Yeah. So again, 30 feet high, 15 feet thick. You have another one? Yep. Yeah, when you start looking closer, you can see the kind of the stacked nature. So this is very difficult because it's a lot of brick making, right? And you, if you're not using a ton of mortar too, you have to get precision down really, really well. Otherwise, this thing's not going to be stable at all. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and move on to our last kingdom that we're going to be talking about here today, and that is Ethiopia. So Ethiopia is in Eastern Africa, near the Horn of Africa, so north and north by a little bit northeast, quite a bit of Zimbabwe. Now, another name for Ethiopia they're going to hear a lot is the Kingdom of Axum. Okay, Axum. And when you're talking about Axum, people are usually referring to Christian Ethiopia, because Christianity among most places, Christianity did not catch on in Africa. Here in this region, Christianity was more accepted than anywhere else basically in Africa. In fact, Christianity spread to the region in the first century. So basically in the first century of Christianity, it made its way into this part of Africa. So it was, though, when so it becomes kind of this dominant feature. Now, the reason it's going to be dominant, though, is because of kings. There's a series of kings that embraced Christianity, right? And that's how it kind of stuck around. Now, when Islam started to show, because Ethiopia here is far closer to the heart of Islam than the other kingdoms we've talked about, so it was introduced a lot quicker. By about this, in the first century of Islam, it started to make its way through Ethiopia as well. So some of that was kind of chipped away a little bit when Islam made its way a few centuries later. But really by about the 12th century, you really see the embracing of Christianity in the kingdom of Aksum here in Ethiopia. Now, something really interesting, though, about this is, again, Christianity introduced so early. Now, Ethiopia, or the kingdom of Aksum here in Ethiopia, basically is an island. It's a Christian, it's not like a literal island, but an island in the sense that everything around it was not Christian. And what I also mean by that is the Christianity being practiced here and the Christian community here is completely actually disconnected from the origins of Christianity back in like Rome. So what I mean by that is their Christianity is going to develop totally independent from both the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. And in fact, it goes on for centuries. You might show up, like if you were a Christian in one of these regions and you showed up in the other one, you might show up and be like, I don't recognize this Christianity at all. Now, there's going to be plenty of core beliefs that are there, but it's going to develop differently. Now, the Christianity again that develops in Aksum will have some unique traditions to it. So, for example, it definitely blended in with a lot of the local traditions, and it kind of just became part of how they practice Christianity. For example, ancestor veneration. So, kind of praising and trying to connect with your passed on ancestors. They would do that. Also the belief in spirits, because again, ancestor veneration and belief in spirits, right? They're spirits after death, kind of around that can be kind of interacted with, were again big traditions that then kind of got adopted by this form of Christianity. Okay. Now, one of the coolest kind of things here that you saw this was some of their architecture of churches. Now, they built 11 or so massive Christian churches from rock. And I'm not necessarily just saying they dug up rock, and built up these stone structures like Zimbabwe did with their walls. I'm talking about dug inside of the bedrock. Okay, it's one of the most unique architectural things that you will find is here in the kingdom of Aksum. Okay, so like this one, check this out. If you can see my mouse as well. So the obvious thing here is this cross-like structure that seems to be right within the earth, right? Now, this is man-made and completely dug out. Now, where's the church? Should the church be like up here? What is this thing? Is this the foundation? No, this is the church, because go down some stairs, and that's what you're actually looking at. We were looking at a picture. This was the top view. Now, when you go down and you get a different point of view, this is what you're looking at. It is built within the rock here. Okay, so yeah, what a very, very fascinating, very unique thing that they were building here. This is, again, this is a church down here in Aksum. Just take a look at that real quick. Very interesting. Again, I'll come back to that picture right there. But yeah, again, kind of top-down view and then a different view. Now, I thought I'd share another kind of really interesting tradition that comes out of Aksum today, and centered around what goes on in this building right here. There's been a long, basically millennia, tradition here in Axum, going back to the days of Moses. Okay, so and it has to do with the Ark of the Covenant, right? The Ark of the Covenant. You get the Israelites, right? They carried it around. It was kind of the casing that they were said to have carried around the Ten Commandments in, right? Well, there was a tradition that said that the Ark, and I guess with the commandments, okay, or at least the Ark here, had actually made its way south, from kind of Egypt, Israel, the whole Middle Eastern region, had made its way down south, and down here in Axum, it was being held. Okay, now this church right here in Ethiopia, is said to be the place where the Ark exists. Okay. This is part of an interesting local Christian tradition, that this building specifically houses the Ark of the Covenant. Now, if you wonder, well, how is there any debate about it? Like, why don't they just go and look for it, right? Why don't they just go in the building? Well, people are not allowed in this building. Okay, this is a secured area. Now, what you can see in this picture, yeah, you got this kind of gated part of it here. And you see this man back here, and I think I have another picture here. I'm going to show you this guy in yellow. This guy is the only person that is allowed here. He lives here and will basically, from what I understand, live his entire life here, being the protector, sort of the Ark of the Covenant here and of this church. He's the caretaker. And yeah, he spends, from what I understand, his entire life. So here's him right there. So he comes out, I guess, every once in a while. But yeah, that is an interesting kind of local tradition out here for the Christians here in Ethiopia, is that they have the Ark of the Covenant. So, but again, people aren't allowed in. The only guy that's around is this guy, and he is the caretaker. So that is his lifelong job. Okay. All right. Let's move now into. So we talked about some of these formations of states. I remember the objective, just going back to the very beginning, if you remember, is understanding the different states and how they developed. So we just talked about them a little bit and some of their features. What we're going to move to now is social structures of sub-Saharan Africa. So what is this? How is society sort of shaped? We did talk about this a little bit when talking about kinship groups. So we're going to expand upon that just a little bit. So society was definitely structured around basically three different aspects. Kinship, so who are you related to? Next is age, because very much so what your job in life is going to depend on your age. They're very age specific about duties. And then gender, right? And gender, male, female, your activities that you're going to be doing are going to be geared towards specific genders. So men dominated what you'd consider the skilled activities. Remember too, this is an agricultural society, and also a little bit more complex. So there is a lot more than just agriculture. There are skilled workers, in depending on which kingdom, in quite a bit of abundance. So leather, they're working with leather. So people that tan leather and manipulate leather into their products, and then blacksmiths. We were saying that iron is being really used at this time period. So iron for weapons, and then probably most importantly, iron for tools, right? For tools. Now, as far as women go, women generally worked in agriculture with food gathering, doing domestic chores, raising children. Not very uncommon to what you would see in other parts of the world, as far as the whole male and female sort of gender roles. Okay. All right. Another thing to talk about, a very prominent part of this time period too, is the use of slavery in sub-Saharan Africa and Southwest Asia. Southwest Asia is basically another name for what we consider kind of the Middle East at this time, but it involves a little bit more of like Iran and those regions too. So it's a little bit more extensive. Now, slavery has had a long history of slavery for a long period of time, and kind of in the classic sense of how are people slaves, under the kind of classic slave acquisition, which was prisoners of war, people that were in a lot of debt and unable to pay debt, so they basically put themselves into slavery, and then criminals. So we've seen this, again, very common. You saw this with like the slavery in the Americas, for example, and other parts of the world. The Americas was our last lesson. So as far as what the slaves are doing, much of it in agriculture. Especially up in southwestern Asia, Iraq, Iran, where you have extensive agriculture. A lot of them were used for that. And that's actually where the slaves kind of came from. The ones that are going to work in Mesopotamia, work in places like Iran, they came from Africa. It's part of a slave trade network, which we're going to talk about here. But most slaves did work in agriculture. However, many did work in households, right? If you have a larger household, as kind of house servants. Now, there were some interesting kind of things about owning slaves too, is that in many kin-based societies, land could not really be owned, right? The idea of land ownership, we have a very different, like especially a Western kind of view of owning land, is very different than in a lot of places in the world. So like they don't really believe in this. You don't really own land like in the Western world. We think of, okay, you own this property and you build a fence around it, right? And that is your land, physical land. That's not really how these societies view it. Land is communal, right? You don't own it. You work it, but you don't necessarily own it. However, people could be owned, right? Slaves, people could be owned. You could own you could own people, but not land. Now, one of the things, of course, that would happen too is if you own slaves, that increased your own personal social prestige, right? Your social status. If you were able to afford a slave, which would have been very, very expensive, and not most people would probably have slaves, but that automatically puts you at a higher social standing, right? Okay, a little more about slavery here. Since many people were enslaved here in Africa, this became kind of the location of where the Middle East got many of their slaves. So you got what was called the Indian Ocean slave trade. So you had these slaves, again, coming out of Africa, and this connected East Africa and then up north along the Indian Ocean kind of coast up to the Middle East. So this system is going to be going on for centuries. And as you've already noticed, this is long before the Atlantic slave trade that Europeans will introduce themselves to in the next unit. So start, really more into like the 1500s and 1600s, and then picking up later 1700s and well into the 1800s. But anyway, so this had been going on a long period of time. This slave trade is extensive for many, many centuries in Africa. In fact, it's the slave trade actually existed into the 20th century in some places in Africa and the Middle East. They were still practicing this slave trade. So it was a very, very long institution. Now, on the topic of slaves, there was also a very interesting set of events, I guess you'd call it, having to do with slavery and the whole social structure kind of system here. And this is called the Zanj Rebellion. The Zanj Rebellion is probably among the two most famous slave revolts in history. Okay, the other one being the Haitian Revolution, but that's going to be centuries later. So here's basically what had happened. In the Middle East, there was, again, an extensive use of African slaves. And in Arabic, they were known as the Zanj. The Zanj were what they called the slaves. Now, this was very, very profitable in Mesopotamia on sugar plantations. Sugar had kind of derived out of Africa, and the planting of sugar is very, very labor intensive. It was also when Europeans started to enter their interaction with Africa and found out how valuable sugar is, that became the biggest slave used product, right? In the Western Hemisphere, in the Caribbean, and places like that. It became the biggest one, as well as the valuable one to use slave labor on. So this had been going on in Mesopotamia. Now, clear back in the 9th century, there were revolts. Okay, there were a bunch of revolts because of the obviously treatment of these slaves and the nature of it being, non-willful. And so the Zand Rebellion was led by a man named Ali bin Muhammad, and with a number of about 15,000 slaves that he led in revolt. They actually had some successful revolts in cities and kind of in areas around Mesopotamia. One of their big kind of achievement was capturing the very, very powerful city of Basra, which today is in modern Iraq, modern day Iraq. Mesopotamia is modern day Iraq, and basically ended up creating their own little splinter government for a while. Now, this rebellion, though, will not have the long term success that like the Haitian Revolution is going to have in a few centuries, because about 10 years later, this rebellion was basically quashed. It was ended. Mesopotamian forces finally were able to fight back and basically obliterated this and ended up actually killing Ali bin Muhammad in the process. But it is one of the most successful slave revolts in history. And let's remember, slave revolts, as far as real successful ones, there are not many. There are not many at all. But this is one of the most successful ones in history by far. It's just a map a little bit of some of the cities and places that were raided by the Zanj in the Zanj revolts. So you can see, if you can see on the map, some of these kind of yellow areas there. So you can see this is all kind of Mesopotamia with its tributaries. This is modern Iraq. So you can see that's where as many slaves had been working as in the fertile plains of Mesopotamia. And Basra down here, which was a capital city in this region. Okay. All right. We're kind of headed towards the end a little bit here. But now we're going to talk about cultural life in sub-Saharan Africa. So a continuity. Now, I've said this in other lessons, but it's very important that when you study a new region, you are always thinking about continuity and change. What things are similar to the previous periods in this region, so what was going on in earlier times, but then also what is different. One of the continuities to keep track of is there's continuities in music. Okay, embracing of music is a major part of their culture. Visual arts and art and storytelling. In fact, much of history in Africa, as it wasn't as nearly an extent in survival of writing, was done through storytelling. Okay. Now, song lyrics also played in kind of a religious sense too, because some song lyrics would be used for communicating with the spirit world. So through music, you would connect with the spirit world. Like we were saying before, there's a lot of tradition that, again, even blended with Christianity when it showed up, with ancestor worship and connection with a spirit world. These are things that had been embraced, regardless, actually, of kind of where you were. But African music had a very distinctive rhythmic. It's a very rhythmic thing, a very distinct vocal patterns and percussive elements using hand claps, right? Bells, pots, gourds. So you had these percussive elements with it as well. And then you had visual arts. And it seems like a lot of the visual arts that we do find from them seem to be religious in nature, having some kind of religious purpose rather than like maybe like recreational purposes. Now, a couple of the kind of more unique things, and the ones that required most skill, was the extensive metalwork actually in art. We talked about metalwork really being popular in this time period, but we talked about it just right now with weapons and with tools. But they would use metalwork in some areas to create like statues and basically art with it. I'm going to show you in just a second what I'm talking about. Probably the most famous place I was using metal art was in Benin. And they would use iron as well as bronze to make some really, really expert art with it. And I'll show you here on the next slide. Okay, check that out. Very, very cool. You see some kind of some warriors and some priests and stuff like that. Here's this stuff is from Benin. So yeah, some of their metallic art that was used. Very, very skillful in nature. Would require a lot of expertise in metallurgy and metalwork. Okay. All right, wrapping up. Another really interesting part of kind of the cultural community in Africa, and also as far as history goes, was the use of people called, I think it's called griots or griotes. I probably butchered that, I'm sorry. But they were storytellers, okay? And they were storytellers that would basically share the history of their peoples with the community. And again, they were very important people, as this is how history and culture was passed down, right? Without the use of a lot of the extensive writing and literacy being such a rarity, this is how information got passed. So these people possessed extensive knowledge of family lineages, and not just of their own, but of other ones too, and told of the great deeds of great leaders of the past. And this is how their stories and their culture and their history was passed down. These were often sung. These stories were basically accompanied as songs. They were part song, part storytelling here. So they would sing these stories. They would also use instruments with them too. So maybe some of the percussive instruments that we were talking about and other instruments there. But yeah, using that. They were very powerful people because they basically held the culture in their hands and were people that were also heavily sought after for advice, because these were often considered like the most learned people of the communities there. So they were both kind of praised or venerated, but then also kind of feared too, because they were very powerful. And again, kings, like we were saying, like leaders, they would seek their counsel and, learn about the past and great deeds of leaders past, so they could maybe emulate those stories in history there. But there were male and female. The men were the griots and the female were the griotes. Again, I might be pronouncing that completely wrong. You often found the women singing in special occasions, things like weddings. So they would come to do that more as maybe even more as a entertainment kind of person. But in what was a very patriarchal society or male-dominated society, this was a way that women were able to be empowered, because in a lot of other cases they may not be. Now, there were female rulers in certain African kingdoms and things like that, but usually that was lesser, right? As you see in a lot of cultures around the world. But this did provide women with an empowerment in society, because as we said, they did have considerable influence. All right, and that's going to wrap up the content for the lesson today. Let's just pause real briefly and kind of look at the big picture with one of the historical developments from the AP curriculum that we sort of covered today. So this also combines definitely in a way with our previous lesson, lesson 1.4 on the Americas, and that's this historical development right here. In Africa, as in Eurasia and the Americas, state systems demonstrated continuity, innovation, and diversity, and expanded in scope and reach. Now, what you need to be able to do for this historical development is, now that you've studied this, and with your readings and with lessons, whatever you're doing in your classroom, is to now provide evidence of these things. Provide evidence, right, of state systems in Africa, Eurasia, and the Americas, right? Examples of continuity, how things stayed the same in this time period, in the same region, and also how it is similar or different than state systems in Africa, Eurasia, and America. So we've now basically covered a lot of that. Eurasia. Our next lesson after this is going to be on Europe, so we'll add them to the fold. But we've looked at the Americas, we've looked at Africa now, we've looked at Southern Asia, we've looked at East Asia. So something to keep in mind is how are things similar and how are things the same? Okay, thinking about that way. But again, how did they demonstrate continuity, innovation, and diversity, and expand in scope and reach? Okay. All right, then, everybody. That is going to wrap it up for topic 1.5 on developments in Africa. Okay. This is bringing a close to Unit 1. Unit 1 of the 9 units that are covered here. So we have one more region to look at. Topic 1.6 will cover Europe. Topic 1.7 is, it's very small. It's not on a specific region. It is on some of the similarities and differences, kind of just connecting some of them in a way. So we got one more to look at before the end of Unit 1. So again, keep studying. In your classrooms, keep ask questions, create dialogue in your classroom. Remember, in AP World History, you are responsible for your learning, right? You are the one in charge. It's not spoon-fed to you. You will be and do as well and know as much as you are willing to put in. That's how it works. Okay. But again, there's help out there. Ask your teachers, ask fellow students. We're all kind of in this together, okay? All right, with that, that is going to end it for today's lesson. We'll see you soon. Keep an eye out for future lessons. If you have missed any, you should be able to find it in the playlist on my channel here, on the Mr. Terry History channel, or History channel here. In the playlist AP World Modern, that's where these will be found. You should see previous ones and the ones that are going to be forthcoming. All right. With that, let's go ahead and that ends it for the lesson here. We're going to go ahead and turn to any of the live interaction that we've had here. If you didn't know, I also do History Teacher React videos, so I get a lot of comments and questions about that. Got a $2 donation from Rias Gremery, who... once we check out a video about it looks like an alternative history video about what if Hitler had won in World War II, which would definitely be an interesting concept, I guess, to potentially think about. But yes, thank you, Reyes, for your donation to the channel. Very much appreciate that. Okay. All right, and that's going to go ahead and end it here today. So we will see you next time. Keep studying hard. You're doing a great job. Take care.